Okay. So does it look about right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of keep going. So we talked a little bit about the different types of carbohydrates that we have. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the numbering system that you're seeing here, these blue numbers. And you kind of see it as well here. So this is another slide. These are just showing you glucose. And what they're showing you is how glucose basically comes together. That's what they're trying to show you here. And so there's just different representations of what's happening here. So this is basically your flat model. And then they're kind of showing you how glucose forms a ring, the mechanism of it. Now, this gets a little kind of organic mechanism. So don't freak out too much about this. But I want to explain it from that perspective, just so you guys can sort of see how it happens. Not that I'm necessarily going to be like, okay, for 20 points, explain the mechanism of how glucose sort of forms a ring, that sort of thing. I'm not going to do that. I just want to show you how we get to glucose, the ring, and then point out the numbering system. So the first thing I want you to notice is in the flat model, you notice you can see all 6 of your carbons here. But the important thing about these is when you're forming a ring, you can see, first of all, the number 1 carbon up here. This should look very familiar to you, right? Especially if you've studied and you're ready for functional groups, right? What does this look like? What functional group does this look like? Nobody's brave enough to venture a guess. As you busily search your notes. Or as you're just walking. What? Close.
Is it carboxyl?
Close. It's certainly related to carboxyl.
Carbonyl?
Yes, carbonyl, right? Which is kind of like, carbonyls and carboxyls are sort of like siblings. But you can see your R group coming in, you have this double bonded oxygen up here terminated in a hydrogen, right? So the terminal functional group of this particular molecule is an aldehyde, right? The aldehyde form. If you recall, the aldehyde is the one that terminates in an H. So this is what's called an aldose, OSE. It's an aldehyde form of a sugar. If you notice, all carbohydrates have this OSE ending on it, right? So like mannose, sucrose, glucose, cellulose, all carbohydrates have this OSE on it. Most of them, not all of them, right? So what happens is when glucose makes a ring, the oxygen of the number 5 carbon here basically will come in and attack that carbonyl carbon, and it wants to form a bond. Well, here's the problem. Can carbon form 5 bonds?
No.
And you guys are like, I don't know, can it? No, it can't. It can't do that. Right. So the question is, if it's going to form a bond with oxygen, then somebody else has got to go, right? And that somebody else is going to be one of these oxygen double bonds. You got 2 of them here, right? So it's like you got 1 to spare. So what's going to happen is as this oxygen comes in, attacks this carbon, forms a bond with it, it's going to kick this pair of electrons, which is being shared with the oxygen, and it's going to go back on the oxygen. Now that pair of electrons then will essentially pair up and form a bond with hydrogen, turning that group into an OH group instead of a double bonded oxygen. That gets you back to 4. That's what's happening over here. So you can see the oxygen is attacking the carbon. These electrons are going to go back onto the oxygen itself. That's going to allow the oxygen carbon to form a bond, creating the ring. And then these electrons will then form a bond with hydrogen, basically turning it into an OH group. So what you see then is the creation of an OH group. But here's the thing. When you take a look at a ring like this, these these molecules here, the OH and the hydrogen, are actually either above or below the ring. So for instance, this hydrogen up here is above the ring, this is below the ring, this is below the ring, this is above the ring. So they're either pointing above the ring or below the ring. And so when you make this an OH group at this carbon 1, you have two different options of where to put this hydroxyl group. If you put it below the ring, then you form a type of glucose that we refer to as alpha glucose. If you put this OH group above the ring, then you form a type of glucose that we refer to as beta glucose. They're still glucose, but they differ just simply in the position of these two OHs, either above or below the ring. Now that creates two different forms, and even though they're still glucose, they do have significant biological effects in them. So they do things differently biologically, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. But here's the thing with the numbering system, and I kind of get around that sort of in a roundabout way. But it's an organic chemistry thing, first of all. Let's just lay it out there. This is just an organic chemistry notational thing. And what organic chemists found out was that we've just been talking about all these functional groups, right? We've been talking about creating these big long chains of carbons and hanging different functional groups on them. And sometimes if we want to talk about a particular functional group on a particular carbon, then we have to determine which carbon we're talking about, right? So here's a good example. Let me draw octane. That's oct for 8. That's going to be 8 carbons. That look right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this from octane to octanol. So I'm going to add a hydroxyl group to it. Okay, I'm going to add it over here. There's my hydroxyl group. Everything else is a hydrogen. I'm not going to fill them in. Just everything else is hydrogen. So if I take a look at this OH group and I say this is octanol, then the question always comes up. It's like, okay, which carbon is the hydroxyl group bound to? Is it bound to the number 2 carbon? Or is it bound to the number 7 carbon? Right? It all depends on how you number it, right? So if you number it like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then it's bound to the number 2 carbon. If you number it this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then it's bound to the number 7 carbon. The problem is, if I say it's bound to the 2nd carbon from the end, there's 2 2nd carbons from the end, right? This one and this one. So which one am I talking about? This is the reason why organic chemists formed a numbering system, so that you could actually communicate which specific carbon you're looking at. And so as a result, what they did was they created from all these functional groups that they study, and there's a lot of them, but what they did was, and it's based on their chemistry and their chemical personalities and things like that, but what they did is they created an order, a hierarchy, if you will, of functional groups, of high priority and not so high priority functional groups. And there's like a pecking order, okay? And as it turns out, right about at the top of that high priority list is the carbonyl. And so the carbonyl is a very high priority functional group. So what does that mean? That means that when they did their nomenclature to standardize everything, what they basically want to do is they want to say basically the highest priority functional groups should be numbered in such a way that they have the lowest number. So, for instance, here I have 2 possibilities with my flat model. I could have easily said that this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The question is, if carbonyl is my highest priority functional group, that one I want to have the lowest carbon number. So that means that I choose that one to be carbon 1, and then I start numbering accordingly. In the case of the octanol, it's the only functional group. Hydroxyl beats out hydrogen. So the numbering convention that makes the hydroxyl group the lowest carbon is this one right here. So this would be 2-octanol if you wanted to use organic notation. So the numbering system, which we see and we utilize and we run into, is an organic chemist trying to sort of make sense of where they are in the molecule so that everybody else who's listening to them talk about it knows where they are in the molecule. It's an organizational tool. Does that make sense? Probably hurt your head a little bit. So this is another look at the different types of carbohydrates. This is a really good one, right? Because we've got our isomers here. So these guys are all, they're all the same, right? These are all isomers. So this is the isomers of C6H12O6. And when you take a look at fructose versus glucose, you can see it's our structural isomer. So what do we mean by that? I mean, we saw the home plate versus the six-membered ring, right? We saw that one. But if you take a look at it from your carbonyl perspective, notice this is also a carbonyl, isn't it? You have an R group coming into your carbonyl carbon and an R group going out. That is a ketone form of the carbonyl, and this is referred to as a ketose. That is a ketone type of carbohydrate. And so we already saw that glucose is an aldehyde type, right? So you have your R group coming in, it terminates in a hydrogen. So this is your aldose. So you have your aldehyde-like and you have your ketone-like, and those are very different structurally, right? This is basically, if you're keeping track, if you're wondering what's going on here, remember when on the functional group slide, remember when I drew propane and I drew propanone for you, right? The ketone, and then all I did was just shift the carbonyl to the end carbon and showed you how that becomes propanal. That's exactly the same thing we're doing here. That's all we're doing here. It's just one form is the ketone if it's internal, and if you shift it to the end, then it becomes an aldehyde type or an aldose. So that's what we mean by structural isomers. So you can see that even though they're the same in terms of the number of atoms, that they're structurally arranged differently because they're composed or built around two different types of carbonyls, either the ketone version or the aldehyde version. Now, when you take a look at the idea of stereoisomer, remember we said the stereoisomers are simply molecules that differ in three-dimensional space, right? So we had enantiomers, which are mirror images. These are non-enantiomer types of stereo images. So if you take a look at galactose and glucose, you'll notice that they're both aldoses, both of them. They both have that terminal carbonyl. The only place that they differ is down here in carbon 4 with the placement of the hydroxyl group, one being above the ring, the other one being below the ring. And that's it. And by the way, I mean, there's a lot of different carbohydrates like this, like these six-membered aldose types of glucose-like molecules. And all they do is they differ by the placement of these hydroxyl groups, either above or below the ring. And we're not going to get into that because they're not necessary. These are the big three. Okay. Questions on monosaccharides before we move into starting to make disaccharides and polysaccharides from these? If you're feeling good, give me a thumbs up.
Do we need to know the structures for the exams?
I will never ask you to write out the structure of a glucose. The only thing that you might want to do is just write it like I write it, cartoon-like.
Okay.
Right? So this is how I write glucose. This is my glucose. That's it. So if you can do that, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, so let's start linking these together, right? So we have a process to do this, don't we? We have dehydration synthesis. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like. So we're going to start linking these together. And the first stop is to make, from a monosaccharide, is to make a disaccharide. And so we're going to take a couple of these monosaccharides, and then we're going to start putting them together and make various disaccharides. So first of all, the first thing we want to do is take a glucose. We're going to start off with alpha glucose. We'll take a look at what happens when we use beta glucose here in just a second. But we're going to take an alpha glucose. And in this particular case, we're going to take another monosaccharide, fructose in this case, right? The structural isomer of glucose. So we're going to take that one. And then there's a specific enzyme that will do this job, by the way, that's specific for these two guys. And what that enzyme is going to do is the first thing it's going to do is it's going to cut the bond right here between hydrogen and oxygen on the glucose. And then it's going to cut the bond between this hydroxyl group and the carbon in the ring for fructose. Now, of course, what happens as soon as I break those bonds? Are we happy anymore?
No.
Right, so because they had their octet rule covered, didn't they? And then we go in there, we break the bonds. And now they're in disarray, right? This is exactly this. So this is a dehydration synthesis, by the way. That's what's happening here, right? So we're just doing a dehydration synthesis. So of course, just like we saw with the mechanism of dehydration synthesis, the enzyme basically pairs up the H and the OH, and it leaves as water. Of course, at this point now, glucose and fructose are not happy. So what they do is they basically say, fine, fructose, why don't you make a bond with the oxygen that's still there on the glucose? And that's what it does. So this guy right here is the bond that forms between glucose and fructose. And we call this a glycosidic bond. By the way, of our 4 major macromolecules, each of the bonds that holds them together has a name. The bond that holds 2 carbohydrates together is the glycosidic bond. Okay, so that's what that is. Now, when you put a glucose and a fructose together, what you're making is sucrose, the disaccharide sucrose. So if I were to ask you guys, go out and find me some sucrose and bring it back, what would you guys come back with?
Maple syrup, honey. I don't know.
No, not quite. It's easier than that. You're just like shopping in the pancake aisle, I guess. That's where we are in the grocery store, where all the jams and syrups are.
Fruits.
You can actually find it. Good. What was that?
Candy.
Candy. Yep. So if you went to the store, you could bring that back, right? If I were baking cookies, what would you bring it back as? I need me some sucrose. Add some sucrose to your tea to sweeten it up. Table sugar. Right? It's just the little white granular table sugar, which obviously has multiple forms. And you mentioned some of them. Right? It's just basic, everyday, run-of-the-mill table sugar. That's what it is. Sucrose. Now, what happens if we put 2 glucoses together? So in this case, you go through the same process, right? Only now you're going to form a glycosidic bond between your 2 glucoses. This is going to create maltose. And so the reason why you make these disaccharides and why these disaccharides are fairly common is because this is a really good form of carbohydrate for your body to use and to sort of transport throughout your body. Matter of fact, a lot of your carbohydrates in your body are transported through your bloodstream as disaccharides because they're easy to transport. And not only that, but they are energy storage molecules. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that here in the next slide. But there are some examples, right? So we have sucrose, which is our table sugar. That's a glucose and a fructose. That's what that one is. And then of course our maltose is a glucose plus a glucose, and lactose is a glucose plus a galactose. So that's what lactose is. And so those are our different types of disaccharides. Now, what happens if you want to build another one? Like what happens if you want to add a 3rd one onto this, or a 4th one, or a 5th one onto this chain? right? You've got a chain going now with 2 monosaccharides linked together. Why don't you just link 3? What about 4, 5, 6, 7? Is there, I mean, why not just keep going? As it turns out, you can keep going. And if you keep going, then you're going to start making polysaccharides. Now, one of the things I want to do, first of all, is I want to take a little bit of a pit stop here, and I want to insert a slide before I get too much further, before I start digging into the polysaccharides. So I want to talk a little bit about the types of glycosidic bonds that we can make. So the first 2 we've seen, right? The first one is what's called a 1,2 glycosidic bond. This is basically where carbon 1 of a hexagonal monosaccharide forms a bond with carbon 2 of a pentagonal monosaccharide. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say a 6-carbon monosaccharide, because both fructose, which is pentagonal, a pentagonal ring, and glucose, which is a hexagonal ring, both of those have 6 carbons, right? They're both C6H12O6. So the 1,2 glycosidic bond is basically what we saw when we're taking a glucose and linking it to a fructose. So this would be the 1,2 glycosidic bond. Why is it a 1,2? Because of the numbering system. Carbon 1 is right here. This is 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is the 2 carbon of fructose. This is the 1 carbon of glucose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these numbers come from our organic chemistry numbering system. So that's the reason why it's a 1,2 bond. So if you take a look at the 2 glucoses, right, this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. You notice this is going to be between a 1 and a 4. That's our next type of glycosidic bond. The 1,4 glycosidic bond. This is where the carbon 1 of a hexagonal monosaccharide forms a bond with carbon 4 of another. So this is an end-to-end joining between 2 hexagonal and it forms a chain. 2 hexagons joining end to end. So this is carbon 1, this is carbon 4. Up on the 1,2, that's carbon 1, this is carbon 2. The last one is a 1,6 glycosidic bond. So this is basically where the number 6 carbon of one monosaccharide forms a bond with the 1 carbon of another, forming a branch. That's what the 1,6s form. So if we have like a long chain, something like that, then a 6, remember your 6 carbon is right out here. So this is your 6 carbon out here. So what's going to happen is you're going to form a bond with another carbon. So this is the number 1, and this is number 6. So it forms a branch. This is 1, and this is 6. So it forms a side chain, a branching side chain. So those are our 3 glycosidic bonds. Okay, any questions on that before we move forward with polysaccharides? So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay. So we're starting to form long chains now, aren't we? So let's go ahead and take a look at this process of forming these long chains. So what we're forming when we form long chains is polysaccharides. So poly means many, saccharides means sugars. What a like saccharide, saccharin is the root for saccharin, which is a type of sugar. That's what polysaccharides are. So these are long chains of monosaccharides that kind of are linked together through this dehydration synthesis that we've talked about now several times. Remember, dehydration synthesis is the common thing that links all of these macromolecules together. So all of these monomers that we're talking about are all linked together with these dehydration synthesis reactions. Okay, so that's common to all of them. That's the reason why we studied dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis, is because those are the common reactions that pulls all of these molecules together. So here's the thing though. When you take a look at your carbohydrates, monosaccharides in particular are your body's preferred fuel source. Matter of fact, if you've got free monosaccharides or disaccharides, which are easily turned into monosaccharides in your bloodstream, your body's only going to burn that. So here's the thing though. What happens if you were to run through all of your monosaccharides? What happens if you burn all your fuel off, right? Then what? Well, obviously you need some backup systems, right? And so you have backup systems. You actually have 3 levels of sort of fuel access. And in a lot of ways, these 3 levels sort of mirror kind of the way our basic finances work, right? So think about your free monosaccharides, your free disaccharides that are heavily circulating in your system. Think of that money-wise like cash in your pocket. If you want to buy some food, like if you're on campus, in between classes, maybe getting a little hungry, if you've got cash in your pocket, you can slap that down and you can get some food, yes? If you have cash in your pocket, you would rather grab that and slap that down and spend that money on food, yes? Is that cash easy to get to?
Yes, it's in your pocket.
Yeah, well, of course, it depends on how your pocket is arranged, right? I mean, some people's pockets are a little easier to navigate than others. But the idea is it's right there. It's completely accessible. And the only thing between you and it is the opportunity to spend it, right? So we call that in finances, we call that liquid assets, something that's easily flowable, easily accessible, easily consumable. That's what we refer to. So that cash is totally 100% liquid, right? That is, it's usable immediately. And so that's kind of like your monosaccharides. That's like your glucose in your bloodstream. That's like, you know, your disaccharides that you have immediate access to. So you burn that first, right? Just like when you're on campus, you grab the cash in your pocket first. Now, what happens if you reach into your pocket and you don't have any cash? Then what? Can you still buy food if you're hungry? Well,
You have a credit card.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly what I was going for. Of course, it depends on who you are, right? I always have to watch out for that one because some people don't do cards or anything like that. They're all cash only. There are a few of us out there that are like that. But for the most part, right, you've got a backup system, right? So you're like, okay, I don't have any cash right now. That's fine. But I do have a backup system. You either have like a debit card, some people like that, or a credit card. Both of those are the same, by the way. It's just a matter of how you access it. They're both secured by the same thing, right? So you don't have a credit card unless you have the ability to pay off the credit card, do you? Nobody's going to give you a credit card if they don't think you can pay it off. So what are you paying it off with then? You get the bill in the mail, and what do you write or what do you digitally send over? How do you pay your bills? With cash? Stuff it in an envelope, off it goes.
With cash from the bank account?
From the bank, right? I mean, in the old days, you would write a check and send it off in the mail. A lot of us do the online thing, so we'll just wire the money from our bank account to the other bank, and so we pay that off. But let's think about this for a second. Most of you, not qualified by most, not all, most of us have more in the bank than we have in our pocket, yes? Yes. That's the purpose of the bank, right? Because usually, like if you get paid, let's say you get paid $1,000 for whatever it is you do, you know, do you want to be walking around with $1,000 of hard, cold cash in your pocket everywhere you go? For some people, the answer to that is yes. For me, I'm like, wait, no, right? I mean, it's like, even if people don't know you're carrying around a lot of money in your pocket, you feel like you've got a neon sign on your head saying, mug me. I feel like that even if I got $5 on myself, right? So obviously there's a security risk, right? Because if you do get mugged, guess what? You've lost your entire paycheck. Why? Because you were carrying it around in your pockets. By the way, why are you carrying that $1,000 around in your pocket everywhere you go? Why don't you just spend it? Let's say you've already eaten. You're not hungry. So you're just going to carry that around.
Oh, is that for later on? Maybe you
for later on, right? So the idea is, I don't need it now because I've just eaten, thank you very much, right? Or I've just done whatever I need to do. I've already paid my bills or whatever. I'm good now, but I've got all this money left over. That's a good thing, by the way, right? But do you want to have all that leftover money on you? I mean, think about it. If you made $1,000 a month and you only used 500 of it, then you're walking around with $500 of leftover on you all the time. The next month it's 1,000. After that, it's 1,500, 2,000, 25, 3,000. After a few years of working, you're going to be walking around with money bags hanging on your neck. Is that a good strategy?
No.
No, you don't need all that money just now, but you're probably going to sometime in the future. So what do? We store it. Right? We store that money. We store it safely. We store it with an institution that we trust, who's going to take care of our money so that we know it's going to be there when we need it. Those institutions we call banks.
Banks, yeah.
Right? That's your bank account. Your bank account is a short-term storage depository to take care of the extra money you have that you don't want to carry around on your person because you would basically get mugged. But it's got to be safe, secure, and it's got to be there when you need it, which also means that you have to have access to it, right? And so a lot of times we set up our accounts and we think the first thing we ask is like, okay, this is great. I like the benefits of this account, but how much access do I have to it? Can I get to this money when I need it, whenever I need it, whyever I need it, right? And so we want to make sure that we have access to that. This is the reason, by the way, why banks started creating debit cards, is so that you can have immediate total access to the funds that you have stored safely in the bank. But guess what? The bank isn't long-term storage, is it? It's more like a short-term storage. It's there to be protected and to kept safe until you need it. And the idea is you're going to need it. You're going to need it in a few months, maybe, when big bills came up. You know, like if you own a house, it's property taxes or homeowner insurance or some sort of bill, car insurance. I mean, we're all facing some sort of big bill. For you guys, it's probably next semester's purchases at the beginning of the semester, right? $1 million worth of books and all that sort of stuff. So, but there's going to be some big thing. Maybe the car needs work on it, and that's going to set you back $1,000. So you know that there's going to be a point in the near future where you're going to need this money, and so you're building up, right, for the rainy day. But it is temporary. It is temporary storage. It's designed to have cash flow into it and out of it. It's designed for you to deposit into it and to withdraw from it. It's designed to be a two-way street, right? So it's storage, but it's liquid storage. It's very accessible. That short-term storage is basically, for the body, is what a polysaccharide is. So this is your short-term storage. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't finish out the analogy, right? Because there's another level of savings, isn't there? There's a less accessible version of storage. Let's say you've got a whole bunch of money and it's just sort of sitting there, mattress-like in a bank, just rotting away, doing no good for anybody except, by the way, for the bank. The bank is making more money off of your money than you're making off of your money. So let's imagine you kind of wake up one day and you're like, you know what? I'm tired of allowing the bank to make millions and billions of dollars off of my money. Why don't I make that money off of my money? And so what do you start doing? You go and you talk to a financial advisor, and they suggest that you go and invest. You got a lot of extra money that you're not going to need for a while. Your job has been good to you. Your costs have been low. So what do? We go out and buy things, don't we? We do things like buying into mutual funds, buy retirement accounts, IRAs, for instance. If we are at a job, we might buy into a 401k, right? These retirement investments. Now, these are long-term storage repositories, right? So the idea is you put money in a 401k, you don't touch that. You don't touch that until you're like 59 and a half, right? If you do, you can, by the way, but if you do, there's going to be some penalties for it, right? You get punished for it. They're designed by nature for you not to have access to them. They're not designed for you to be able to pay your bills from them. These are things that you buy into them. You let them do their thing. You let them grow. You just let them, leave them alone. And hopefully in a few years when you're ready to retire, you'll have a lot of money in there. That's the idea, right? But you can cash out your 401k. But generally speaking, any financial advisor worth their salt will tell you that if you're cashing out your 401k, you're probably in some deep doo-doo. I mean, financially, your back is against the wall. You are in trouble. Why? Because you do not want to incur the penalties that you're going to get with a 401k unless you're absolutely desperate. Like you're literally on the cusp of losing your home. You're dancing with foreclosure, and you got to drain your 401k so that you can make the mortgage and keep your house. Those are the sorts of things we're talking about there. So those are designed for you not to touch them because they're designed to allow you to be able to be solvent in a time in your life when you're older, when you have less income or no stable income, to make sure that you have your needs met. That's what they're designed to do. They're not designed for you right now. They're designed for you then. So what's the biological equivalent to the investments? It's your lipids. Your fats are your biological 401k. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get rid of fat, just like it's difficult to liquidate a 401k. There's penalties to using your fat, just like there's penalties to the 401k. And your body only lets the fat go if it's in desperate situation, which is the same thing with your 401k. Why? Because just like your 401k, it's designed to save you at a time when you're not able to earn the wage that you're earning now. Because you're older, you're retired, you've got lots of healthcare costs maybe that are piling up. It's designed to save you when your financial famine comes for you. Just like your fat, your body fat is designed to save you when your biological famine comes for you. That's the reason why it's so hard to get rid of fat, is because your body is wired to hang on to it desperately, because your body's always thinking that just right around the corner, the famine's going to start. And only those of us who have our saddlebags full, so to speak, and our spare tires filled are going to have enough reserve energy to live and survive the famine. Those of us who are lean and mean, marathon machines, we're going to die the second the famine hits. Because we have nothing to back up on. There's no fat reserves there. So all of us who are so-called in shape and like really chiseled, like 0% body fat, it's like, hey, looking great, all that. So they're going to die. They're going to die first in the famine. But those of us who are always kind of moaning and groaning because we got a little bit of chub on us, we're going to survive. And that's the way your body thinks. That's the reason why it's so difficult to get rid of fat. But that's your long-term energy storage plan. So it kind of all fits together. Polysaccharides are your short-term. So if your body's preferred fuel source is monosaccharides, this is what it burns first. Then what's level 2? What if you burn through all of your fuel, your monosaccharides? Well, what it goes to next is your carbohydrate, your polysaccharides, starches, right? Starches basically are the storage energy for plants. So if I burn through all of my monosaccharides, then I'm immediately going to go into my starches if I'm a plant. If I'm an animal, I've got an animal starch called glycogen also. This is for animals. So what happens if I burn through all of my glucose, for instance? Or then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start taking the glycogen that I've got built up in my system and start burning that. What happens if I go through that? Well, at that point, then, once I burn through all my glycogen, all my starches, and all my free monosaccharides, then I'm going to go after fat. And it's only then that I go after fat. This is one of the reasons why, if you want to do kind of like a fat burn workout, a fat burn workout is not so much strenuous as much as it is a little bit of a lower level. It's always cardiovascular. It's a cardio workout, right? So you're breathing a lot. So you want to be able to breathe and not punish yourself, but it's continuous. It's an enduring type of a thing. So think of burning fat workouts as sort of like a slow burn. This is the one where you don't just run a 40-meter dash, right? That doesn't do anything for you. What you do is you run miles, but you run it at a slow, consistent pace. That slow, consistent pace will basically start burning your fat engines to kind of fuel that long endurance type of strategy. So these guys are two types of polysaccharides that are nutritional. So plants make starches for their needs. That's to fuel them, right? But we also benefit from that. Anybody who's eaten a potato has benefited from that. And in animals, we make glycogen. Now, the way this kind of works is let's imagine that, you know, that it's like one of the big eating holidays, like Thanksgiving is always my favorite because it's notorious in the West, right? It's like the one-day glutton fest where we get to slay all of our guilt aside and we get to pretty much just gorge on anything we want. So imagine it's like Thanksgiving, and you've just basically, you know, annihilated 3 species of bird in one day. I'm looking at you, turducken fans. And that's before you get to the pies and all the desserts, right? But the idea is, I mean, you have a good feast on Thanksgiving Day, and here it is in the afternoon, and you're having a hard time breathing because you're so full. All you can do is manage to just lay on the couch and just sort of roll over a little bit to watch the football game. The question is, you just ate a ton of energy. You just ate a ton of glucose, right? So the amount of glucose in your bloodstream after that meal is titanic. But here's my question to you. Are you going to need all that glucose energetically? Are you going to need that?
No.
No, right? Because your biggest ambition right now is laying on the couch watching football. Not a lot of energy associated with that. So are you just going to let all that glucose go? It's like, you know, I don't need all of this. I'm just going to take what I want and what I need right now, which is not much. And then I'm just going to let all the rest, I'm going to flush all the rest of it. Is that your strategy? Is that a good idea?
Yeah. No, you're going to store it.
Yeah, right. It's just like you don't flush the extra $500 you got. I mean, does anybody do that? No. Right. So you store it. So the body says, listen, we're going to pack all this stuff into a short-term storage facility. That's our glycogen for animals, starches for plants, and we're going to pack this away for a rainy day. Of course, it's Thanksgiving. You've eaten a lot more than your starch reserves can handle. So that then moves into what? You fill up your bank account, and then you do what? You start adding to your investments, don't you? So you fill up your starch reserves, and once those are full, because you only have limited capacity as an animal to store starch, you're not like a plant. We'll talk about that in a second, right? But you basically, once you fill up your starch reserves, then you start filling up your fat reserves. And this is the reason why we gain weight over the holidays, because we eat in excess of what we need. We fill up our starch reserves, which are limited, and then we will start adding it to our long-term reserves, which is our fat reserves. Now, the reason why, and I want to stop here for a second, because this is all biological application here, right? This is a point worth making. These are things worth thinking about and sort of exploring a little bit, because this really is where that kind of biological rubber hits the road. This sort of forms our reality. I mean, who hasn't overeaten on a holiday, and who hasn't suffered the weight gain consequences of such overeating? And then we're kind of working on that for a while. Who hasn't, stressed out and been frustrated over trying to lose weight or trying to slim down, and it's not moving as quickly as we want it to, So these are all, this is all part of our biology, right? This isn't so much about psychology. This is all part of our biology. This is what we're talking about here. Now, there's one thing at one point I really want to make. I want to make it quite clear, right? Because a lot of times when you take a look at us, plants make starch, we make starch. Great. But you know what plants don't do? Plants don't get fat, do they? Have you ever seen a fat plant?
Not really.
No.
No, they don't store lipids, right? So they don't have spare tires. They don't have, they don't have love handles or saddlebags, right? So they don't have this. So all they have is starch. That's all they've got. So for them, their starch, they have to have a long-term version of that. So now we store fat. That's what we do. But plants don't. So the question is, how do plants then survive? How do they do this long-term, right? So do they just only have bank accounts that they fill up? Don't they have retirement investments? And the answer is they do. But what plants do is plants will have in them this, like a good plant. My plant will have roots, and they'll have lots of them, right? So plants have lots of these structures that they can sort of do without, or they can grow new ones. They can do whatever they want, right? But what they can do is they can say, listen, I want to make a lot of starch. So I've got all these leaves that are making these carbohydrates, and I'm going to form starches in them. But you know what? I'm going to take this little root over here, this guy right here, and I'm going to basically load that up. I'm just going to sort of sacrifice that root because I got plenty of other roots. I'm good, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load that one up with starch. And so that thing's going to fill up and swell up with starch. I'm just going to load it in there. It's going to be my storage silo for starch. And I'm going to maybe do another one over here. I'll sacrifice that one and I'll form like a bunch of starch there. Maybe this one over here, and I'll form some starch there. So I can sacrifice this. Why? Because I got plenty of roots. I can grow more. I can grow as many roots as I want. So I can sacrifice some of these little roots, and I can just fill these guys up with starch. And these will become like little starch repositories. And not only that, but then that's got to be like my long-term strategy. So I got more than I need because I have a good, healthy root system. So I'm going to take the excess. I'm going to store it in these large structures. Plants can do that. Right. And so, of course, at the end of the season, this guy dies off, right? And then what do you have underneath the ground? Some of you might recognize this. I basically drew what kind of a plant?
A potato.
Yeah, it's a potato plant. How many of you guys have grown potatoes? It's always fun to do that. Nobody? No potato farmers? They're always a lot of fun because everything's underground, obviously, right? You go to harvest these potatoes. And part of the problem with this is, you're kind of digging around in there and you think you got all the potatoes, but there's always that little itty bitty potato that you missed. And then what happens is you missed it. And then the next season, what happens?
Another one grows.
Yeah, right. You get another potato. Matter of fact, if you go to like the nursery, they don't sell. I mean, they do sell you. Some of them will sell you potato plants, but most of them don't, do they? What you end up buying is like a bag of what? Of like little seed potatoes. Like they're like itty bitty potato lips. Because when you put that little potato in there, or like if you have a potato and it starts growing eyes on it, you can actually cut that potato. Like here's a potato, and like here's a little eye coming out right there, right? Just basically cut like a square, put that in the ground. That'll turn into a potato plant. So you can actually take a potato with like multiple eyes growing out of it, and you can actually grow like lots of potato plants. If you want ever to try it, it's a lot of fun. But basically, this guy's going to grow and turn into next year's potato plant. Why? Because that potato is full of starch. a lot of fun. The reason why I love potatoes is because you can actually grow like an entire garden full of potato plants by just buying like one like 5-pound bag of potatoes and then letting them all start sprouting. And it's like you got an entire like potato crop. It's like you basically got an entire garden full of potatoes for free, basically, because they can't really stop them from dying like that. It's a great vegetable. Buy one. You can either eat it or you can grow it. You kind of get it for free. So it's always fun when you can do something for free because you can't really do that much in these days. Right. But the idea is this is the reason why they don't get fat. Why? Because they designate specific structures to actually load up the starch in them. Now, we can't do that. Right. We can't say, OK, I've got a little pinky finger. I got another one, so I don't need to do anything. So I'm just going to fill that up with starch. If we do that, then it's going to turn like into a little club, like a little softball on the end of our hand. Now, imagine trying to play the piano with this big club-like pinky, right? So our structures are already defined. They already have a job. They're already doing something. A plant is different, right? And none of that, but we can't just say, oh, well, I'm going to grow an extra finger and that's going to be my potato club. We can't do that. The structures we have are the structures we have. We can't just grow and decide to grow new ones. Plants can grow new stuff all the time. So they're very malleable that way. So their body, the way their body looks is a lot of ways defined as an adaptation as they adapt to their environment, right? So they can do a lot of that. We don't. Our body is already designed and already like instructed, right? So we already have the instructions to build our body. So we can't do what a plant does. So our plan is already set down. So the question is, where do we put ours? Well, we have to put ours actually in places like our liver and our skeletal muscles. That's where we have to store our glycogen. But the problem is we can only store so much there, right? Okay, because they have other things to do, right? They're not storage supplies. Your liver does just about everything in your body. So it's like, you know what? I'd love to store more glycogen, but I've got actually liver things to do. So I've got a job. So I need to do my job. So I'm not a storage unit for glycogen. You know what? You're going to have to turn yourself into fat and you're going to have to go hang out in the adipose cells in the fat tissue. That's their job, is to store energy long term. Okay. So the other two types of polysaccharides are they're structural in nature. So these guys are indigestible. You can eat them, but you're not going to be able to digest them. You're not going to be able to make use of them. And so we're talking largely about cellulose, which is a component of the cell wall, or the plant cell wall. And we'll take a look at cellulose up close here in just a second. The other one is called chitin. This one basically is kind of something unusual. This actually contains nitrogen in it. So that's a little on the unusual side. But chitin is a structural carbohydrate that forms the exoskeleton of insects, right, of arthropods. And it's also the body of fungi, that kind of spongy kind of, that kind of sponginess of a mushroom, for instance, of like a mushroom cap. Okay, that's what chitin forms. Now, when you're taking a look at this, like in chitin, we're not going to talk a lot about chitin. So this is our last chance to talk about chitin. So I just want to give you an example of where you see chitin. Obviously, we've all seen the business end of a mushroom before, so we all kind of know that kind of spongy cap-like situation going on with a mushroom. But with an exoskeleton, we've kind of seen this a lot. So a lot of times we don't realize, some students don't realize this is insects don't have an internal skeleton the way we do, right? So they have an exoskeleton. So what they have is a hard armor-like shell. And then all of their body tissues are arranged inside them, like in an open, hollow space. And as a matter of fact, you guys have seen the evidence of chitin before, right? Because have you ever cleaned out a windowsill? Like maybe during the summer, things are kind of getting dirty, of course. And the reason why I pick summer is because there's usually flies flying all over the place, right? They kind of get in the house, you leave your doors open, they let the dogs in and out like we do here. But have you ever cleaned out a windowsill and you kind of seen that little fly in the windowsill, and you go to like clean it up or pick it up, and then it just basically crumbles into dust? Have you ever experienced that? You guys are like, no, I've never cleaned a windowsill before in my life. So what that little shell is, that little crumbling thing, that's the exoskeleton. That's chitin. Do you know what happened there? Do you know why that little fly is empty? And these things are real weird, right? Because it looks like a little fly. I mean, it's like if you look at it, you're like, okay, this fly is alive, right? And you gotta go to swat it or whatever, and it just crumbles on you, just turns to dust. You know what happened to that fly? More than likely, a spider got it. Because you know how spiders eat? Where are my arachnologists in the class? How do spiders eat?
You mean like when they catch the food in their, I'm sorry, I don't know how you call the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what do?
They eat it? No.
So what is, like if you watch a spider, and different spiders are different, right? So this is a very huge generalization. But if you watch a typical spider, oftentimes what'll happen is you get your little fly, right? It gets caught in the web. It's a web making spider. And then what happens? The spider comes over and then it does what?
Realizes the bug.
It bites them, right? And so a lot of times when it bites them, it injects its fangs into it. A lot of times we think of it as sort of like a snake, right? You're injecting venom to kill the fly. But generally speaking, oftentimes the spider's not actually trying to kill the fly. It's doing something else, actually. It does have venom, that's true. But most of the spider venom isn't necessarily designed to kill the fly as much as to paralyze the fly. What it's really doing, however, is it's injecting hydrolytic enzymes into it. What are hydrolytic enzymes? What do they do?
I'm guessing this has something to do with breaking them down. So hydrolysis, I guess.
Exactly. That's a good way to break down the word, right? Hydro, water, lytic is a variant of lysis, cutters. So a hydrolytic enzyme does what?
Break down the food that he eats.
It breaks down macromolecules, right? It's a hydrolysis reaction. So it's injecting this fly with hydrolytic enzymes. By the way, that's what you do when you digest things. You bathe the food that you've eaten in hydrolytic enzymes to break it down into macromolecules, into monomers, so that you can absorb them. In this case, basically what the spider is doing is essentially it's like instead of swallowing it into a stomach, it's taking the contents of its stomach and injecting it into the fly. You know, the spider does something interesting next. Oftentimes what will happen is once the spider bites, it'll go away. Sometimes the spider will wrap it up, right? And then it'll kind of go away for a little while. Why do you think the spider leaves? I mean, isn't it hungry? Right? I mean, it's like, you just got your food. Why would you just walk away? Why did it walk away?
Does it need time to break down?
Yeah.
Exactly, right? Because it knows it's got to take time to allow those hydrolytic enzymes to break down all the tissues inside the fly. So then when it comes back later on, and it basically has like a little macromolecule monomer milkshake. it just basically sucks it all out. Little fly milkshake. And then what's left over?
The exoskeleton.
Exactly. An empty shell. And we find that on our windowsill. And that exoskeleton is made out of chitin. So there's a lot of biology in there, isn't there? Because not only is the spider sucking out using hydrolysis, which we just learned about, breaking down those macromolecules so that he can eat, leaving behind a chitinous exoskeleton, but the spider himself also does not have an internal skeleton, also has an exoskeleton. So you can see there's a lot of biology just talking your way through these macromolecules and the process of what's happening. So if you think about it then, if you just take a look in the example of the spider, is what the spider is doing is basically acquiring monomers. Why? So that it can build its own molecules. That's what it's doing. So when you eat food, you eat for two reasons. You eat for energy, right? You eat energetic molecules, and you also eat for building materials. You acquire monomers to build your own proteins, to build your own DNA. So you're always doing those two things whenever you eat something. So let's take a look at these starches up close, the utility of glucose and the structure of these molecules. So when you take a look at an alpha glucose, and you go through dehydration synthesis and you link these alpha glucoses, right, in a 1-to-4 linkage, we learned about that. End to end, you notice your bond angles are pointed downward. This is your 1,4 glycosidic bond right there. That's what these guys are right there. Then you're going to form a long chain of glucoses. And if you continue to form a long chain of glucoses end to end in these 1,4 linkages, you create plant starch, which we refer to as amylose. And when you form these 1,4 linkages, they tend to sort of form this little corkscrew-like structure. Amylose does. Now, oftentimes what will happen is in order to allow you to be able to store more in a small space, oftentimes you'll utilize a 1,6 linkage. So here you can see the number 1 carbon with the number 6 carbon. That's your 1,6 linkage right there. I just circled it. And you're going to form a side chain or side branch. When you do this with amylose, so here's your amylose chain right here going through there like that. When you form your little side chain with your 1,6, you notice you're going to start another little coil heading off on the side. But this forms what's called amylopectin, right? We oftentimes will encounter this in culinary as fruit pectin. And so typically usually plants will form a little bit of branching. They don't do a lot of branching because they've got entire structures like, used up roots, for instance, to be able to store as much amylose as they want. So they don't have to branch necessarily as much as the animals do because they've got entire structures to load this up with. But if you think about it, right, in culinary practice, you have things like fruit pectin, and then you also have like cornstarch. Both of these are starches. Fruit pectin is a branched starch, but they're both culinarily used for the same purpose. They're thickening agents, right? And so that's how you. So when you look at fruit pectin, it's like a special type of a fruit starch. That's basically what it is. Now let's take a look at animals. Let's take a look at glycogen. So in animals, what they do is they go to town on branching. So if you take a look at an animal, you'll have your central chain, and then they'll start to form lots of these 1,6 side chains in animals. And then what's also going to happen is these side chains will start to form side chains. And then the side chains will form side chains on the side chains. Which will form side chains on the side chains, on the side chains, on the side chains. To the point where it starts to get really hard to figure out where the original chain was. So you can see there's massive amounts of branching, and this whole little clump right here, we refer to as a glycogen granule. It's like a little granule of glycogen. And we tend to form these in these little black circles that we see here in liver cells. So these are stored in liver. And you also have glycogen in skeletal muscles. So because you don't have a lot of space to store it, you have to pack a lot of this in a very small space. That's the reason why animals do a lot of branching with their glycogen. So this is their short-term energy reserves. Okay, so remember, in order to make starches, we used linkages, 1,4 linkages of alpha glucose. Now, let's take a look and see what happens if we make these same 1,4 linkages. Only in this case, let's say we're going to use beta glucose instead. So if we link together beta glucose with these 1,4 linkages, so 1 to 4, 1 to 4, and so forth, what's going to happen is this bond angle is going to alternate. So half the time it's going to point upward, half the time it's going to point downward. Okay. Now what this does is when you form these in a long chain, they basically form these long sort of flat-like structures. They don't coil like it does with alpha glucose. And what that means is you can pack these guys together very tightly, and you can form like these little, like structural little fibers. It looks like a little rawhide, like a little rawhide rope. And this becomes very structural in nature. Now, one of the things to understand is with cellulose, right, that's basically what this is. You can't digest cellulose, right? So here's the question. Where do we see cellulose? Well, where you see cellulose is in plant cell walls. Matter of fact, the best, if you want to see cellulose, go eat some celery. How many of you guys like celery? Any celery lovers?
I like it in my smoothies, but not to eat it like that.
So the problem with celery, and the reason why a lot of people don't like celery is because of the fibers, right? Those kind of thread-like little fibers that get stuck in your teeth and that sort of thing, right? Those little thread-like fibers are that's cellulose. Okay. Another place to see cellulose in cell walls is a modified type of cellulose is pretty much in the cell walls of any plant. Do you guys remember seeing Elodea and also the onion slides? Remember the little rectangular look of them? And in the Elodea, some of you guys saw the little green circles in there, but you saw these like little green like rectangles. Those cell walls are made out of cellulose. The cell walls of the onion are made of cellulose. Lumber, wood. Wood is actually modified cellulose. How so, you ask? Or not? Well, if you take a look at a tree, in the center of a tree is what's called the heartwood, right? This is where the vasculature is of a tree. So this is like the living cells. What happens is these cells add to themselves, and the ring kind of pushes outward like that. As the rings get further away from the center core, they lose contact with their nutrients and they die. Then what happens is, especially in woody plants like trees, what happens is the trees fill these dead vacant cells, the cell walls anyway, with a structural protein called lignin. It's like cement. And that makes the cells rigid and hard. So when you lignify these cells, it creates this hardness that we associate with wood. So wood is really hardened, lignified cell walls, made mostly of cellulose and lignin. So wood is basically cellulose for the most part. Now, the thing with cellulose is we can't digest it, right? Matter of fact, cellulose is part of what we refer to as insoluble fiber. Essentially, we can't digest it. It goes straight through us, okay? Why? And the answer for why we can't digest this is because we simply just don't have the enzymes. This is indigestible. We don't have the enzymes for it. So let's take a look at an enzyme, first of all, for our starch, the ones we do have. An enzyme has in it a three-dimensional pocket called an active site that's designed to fit, kind of lock and key like, or like square hole, square peg like, with its substrate, in this case, the starch. So what will happen is this enzyme will have a three-dimensional pocket that will fit this terminal glucose. That's good. Then it'll have another little pocket that will fit this downward angle. And then it'll fit this glucose, and then it'll fit this downward angle, and it'll fit this glucose. So everything fits. And so this is a happy enzyme. Okay. And we can chop that up. So we can basically do work on that starch. But the problem is we don't have enzymes to fit the beta glucose one. So here's the enzyme we have. We have an active site that will fit this glucose. So far, so good. We have a downward pocket that will fit this downward angle. Good match. That's a good one. We have a pocket that fits this glucose. But now we have a downward pocket, a little pocket that's supposed to fit a downward angle. But guess what? This is not a downward angle, so that doesn't fit. And enzymes are very sensitive to three-dimensional shape and fit. So if it doesn't fit in one area, it doesn't fit at all. So this enzyme can't do anything with cellulose. That's the reason why we can't digest it. It's kind of like wearing a glove, right? I mean, can you sort of cram a left-handed glove on a right hand? Yeah, right. I mean, you can probably cram some fingers in the finger holes. It's going to be a little weird though, right? Because the index finger would be in the pinky side of the glove. It wouldn't really fit that well. The pinky would be in this overly large index finger hole. This thumb would be trapped because the thumb part would be on the other side. I mean, you could kind of, but it's not going to work, is it? You're not going to wear that for shoveling your driveway today. So you don't have gloves. You basically say, listen, I don't have gloves to fit this. And that's simply why we can't digest cellulose. Okay. Questions on carbohydrates before we move into proteins? Feeling good about carbohydrates? Wanting to be a carbohydrate biochemist now?
We will see when the exam comes how we feel about carbohydrates.
Yes, you guys are like, yeah, everything is subject to the exam, right? Don't want to commit too early. Okay, so proteins. Proteins are important because they do just about everything. So most of the hard work in the cell is done by a protein. So let's think about what some of these things are. Well, proteins will drive chemical reactions, right? So they're the chemical catalyst for most of the chemical reactions in your body. Most of those chemical reactions don't come for free. So it takes a little bit to get them to move forward. And proteins, enzymes, will do that. Your defense, your immune system is driven by proteins, right? Antibodies, for instance, are proteins. So that's your defense. Transport, proteins are important for moving things in and out of the cell. Also, they're important for moving lipids around through your body. We'll talk about that here in just a second. They're also supportive, right? Like for instance, your bone, a good chunk of the actual material, the actual tissue of your bone has a lot of protein in it. And so your support system, your bones, your cartilage, your connective tissue are all based on proteins. And also the skeleton of the cell, we'll talk about that in the next chapter, is also part of the cell support system, and it's also made out of protein. If a cell needs to move, it's made out of protein, right? If you need to control and regulate chemical reactions, right? Regulate how you turn things on and turn things off. Those are typically proteins, like your endocrine system, for instance. Some of your hormones are actually proteins. So they're like insulin, for instance, is a protein type hormone, and that regulates glucose. And of course, storage. So storage is something we see a lot, especially with lipids, for instance, right? How many of you guys have gone to the doctor and you've done like a lipid panel? You've had your cholesterol checked. Anybody ever do that? Nobody? You guys are just perfect health?
Maybe we don't want to know.
Yeah, well, not necessarily what it was, right? But if you've had it done, right? You check your cholesterol, or you know somebody who's had their cholesterol checked, right? So we're not actually checking cholesterol because cholesterol is a lipid. And so you don't have free cholesterol floating around in your blood. That's just not a thing, right? Because your blood is mostly made out of what? Your blood is going to be mostly made out of water, right? And what happens when you put a lipid in water? Like the oil and water experiment? It separates, doesn't it? So oil doesn't work well in water. So what proteins do, there's a special group of proteins. Actually, what we measure in the lipid panel when you guys have your cholesterol checked is not so much the cholesterol, but the proteins whose job it is to store the cholesterol in them. So there's a group of proteins called lipoproteins. And their job is to basically grab onto lipids and sort of hang on to them so that they can sort of shuttle them around the body in this watery matrix that we call the blood. And that way it keeps the lipids from sort of layering like oil and water, right? Because once they layer like that, you're not going to be able to move the oils and the lipids from point A to point B so you can use them. So there's a group of proteins whose job it is to actually store these lipids in them so that they can move the lipids around the body, okay? Those are some pretty heavyweight functions of the proteins. Matter of fact, if I did this with one of my other sections. I said, give me some function in your body, and there's a protein that's involved in it, that's doing it, and that's driving it, right? And that's pretty much true. Your proteins carry out the functions. And so one of the things that we want to do is, just like with all the rest of them, we want to first of all break down the monomers before we build our polymer. We already talked a little bit about this, right? Because our monomers are our amino acids. And so generally speaking, our protein itself is basically a long chain of amino acids that are put together. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the amino acid structure just to remind ourselves, right? We already said that amino acids are all composed of the amino section, right? That's basically this group right here. And on the other side is going to be the acid section. So this is your carboxylic acid, right? We got that with the functional groups. So that is your carboxylic acid. In the middle is what's called your central carbon, this guy right here. There's two things attached to it. A hydrogen on one side, that's your single hydrogen, and then an R group that has 20 different versions of that. So all of the amino acids are the same. All of the backbone components of an amino acid are the same. So for instance, the central carbon, all amino acids have, same. The amino group, same in all amino acids. Carboxylic acid group, same in all of them. The single hydrogen is the same in all of them. The only thing that is different from one amino acid to the other is the R group. And so these different R groups will have different types of side chains to them, and they will have different personalities and chemical traits to them. And so what I want to do next time is go over these R groups and sort of get an idea of what types of chemical personalities we can generate with these R groups. And that'll be a good starting place. So that'll be next Wednesday, since we have an exam on Monday.